In demanding a government for the people, Lincoln gave no indication of what might be, in various cases, the benefit of each people. He was thinking of the United States as a signal exception among nations, as by the occupation of a vast and almost empty continent. It certainly was, and he was contrasting the vacant freedom of such an opportunity with the notorious domination of many other countries by governments that served the fancy of extravagant monarchs or ministers, often in contempt of the public good. I think that the prudent Machiavelli, even when serving only the interest of his prince, that is, the stability of any given government, would have directed that prince's attention to the need of maintaining the economic and intellectual vigor of his subjects. Such vigor, with peace, or with few, short, and successful wars, would strengthen the prince's authority at home and his reputation and influence abroad much better than could the best planned intrigues and assassinations. Similarly, an ecclesiastic who governed the church with a spiritual and charitable zeal would establish the ascendancy of his faith more securely than by persecution and nepotism. Machiavelli himself, in his discourses, where he philosophized more freely than in The Prince, dreamt of greatness for Italy rather than for its petty tyrants. It is the absence of solid intelligence that renders governments cruel to their subjects and fatal to themselves. The happy operation of a government, on the contrary, silences grievances and interweaves its action with the rooted habits of the people, no matter how casual the foreign origin of that government or irrational its traditional form. The people that counted in Lincoln's world, and especially in his party, were self-made men like himself, and it was natural to assume that they knew their own interests, and if left alone, would spontaneously secure them. There were, indeed, political storms, even tornadoes, but these were abnormal and unnecessary, born of ignorance and ancient usurpations. The natural success of each enterprising, honest individual would open fresh opportunities to the enterprise of others, and the freedom of each would make the happiness of all. Such was the ideal prospect, but soon the complication of industries and of civilized life bred private societies, educational, religious, and commercial, to cultivate the liberal interests of like-minded groups better than each individual could have done for himself. As those private institutions grew powerful and semi-public, national and local governments also became complex, far beyond the intellectual range of any one man. Ministries and departments of state acquired an inevitable internal autonomy, with technical methods and indispensable permanent officials, ready to advise and to check the ignorant ardor of reforming ministers, dupes of their own eloquence. A traditional, practicable, but cumbrous way of doing everything imposed itself on each newly elected government, and the vested prejudices of each department even became, in many cases, the fountain of orthodox public sentiment and policy. May we assume, in traditional governments of this kind, a clear sense of who the people are whom they exist to serve, and what are the interests of that people? I think that this sense in governments is often clear, but seldom just. The judges, kings, and prophets of Israel, for instance, knew that the people were simply the Jews, insofar as they obeyed and enforced the law of Moses. And similarly, most of the communist governments of our time know that the people are simply the communists of all nations, insofar as they obey the central inspiration of Moscow. These are militant sectarian or party governments that may be perfectly just within their fold, but neither creed is ideally content with that limitation, and both propose for their ultimate goal the unanimity of the remnant of mankind, when all recalcitrants have been exterminated. For the point of view of mankind at large, and even of human nature, and professed communists or Orthodox Jews, this is a cruel injustice to the natural centrifugal development of vital liberty in man, in which the ancient Jewish and the modern communist regimens are only local, temporary, and arbitrary formations. These are extreme cases of militancy. Ordinarily, the question of whose good and what good a government should pursue solves itself without discussion. The people to be served by a government are all those within its jurisdiction whom it can actually control, tax, imprison, execute, or forcibly enroll for military service. Less clear is the question of what good the people, or special classes among them, will derive from being thus governed. But this question for the government is not urgent. The government has its traditional, well-known daily duties to perform. It is the people's business to get as much good out of their government as they can. They too have current commitments, chiefly financial, but also domestic, moral, and imaginative. Commitments that, like family responsibilities, it is for each of them too late to elude. And the original grounds for these vested interests are too complex and perhaps remote for practical minds to trouble about or try to understand. What a man lives for is hardly better known to a man, or less often falsely described in orations, than what the government works for. There are, for both, incidental successes and failures clearly distinguishable, but ultimate aims are not discerned, for the excellent reason that they do not exist. The generative order of society proceeds not towards an ultimate good, but by a concourse of tentative actions, each more or less expressing a particular need, passion, or purpose. And the total issue is a compound of clashing endeavors and checkered fortunes. In the individual, however, there exists, at least potentially, a natural living witness of these psychic dramas, that synthetic glance, which Kant called the transcendental unity of apperception, and which I call spirit. Spirit, arising in a man, can feel those diverse inclinations surging within him. It can see them evoking images and precipitating worlds that anticipate their possible satisfaction. It can perceive one or another of them dragging in and absorbing the whole momentum of his life for a moment, as if only that master impulse were real and were right. If the moment is propitious, probably action follows, and the intoxication of it slowly yields to the perception of the material consequences, making success or failure, or a troubled mixture of both. And later, the other inclinations, obscured for a while, come trooping back, disgusted at having been neglected, and still clamoring. Each passion initially claims the right to its vital liberty, but when, in the tight arena of the psyche and of the world, it finds itself thwarted or stifled by rival passions, it egotistically detests the others, and would prompt the spirit to call them sinful and wrong. Thus the poor spirit, in its unarmed intelligence and justice, is torn between natural sympathy with each of those passions, and the hatred felt for it by all the others. This war in the psyche, so dimly and sadly lighted by reason, is reproduced on a larger scale in society and in the rivalry of nations. But there is a radical difference between the status of reason and justice within an individual and their status in any political conflict. For in any concourse of individuals, there is no living seat for observation or judgment except those individuals themselves. It is sheer conceit in a contemporary neutral or in a later historian to pose as a superior and impartial spirit. For his spark of spirit is kindled in a human psyche, no less subject to passions and accidental interests than those that, from a cold and distorting distance, he presumes to understand and to criticize. He is indeed free and even obliged to judge from his particular point of view, but his judgment will not represent the scope of his own knowledge and sympathies, not any valid criterion present in the facts themselves. Moral distinctions express the bias of primal will, grown clearer by differentiation into more and more particular and complicated psyches. You cannot recede from distinction into impartiality. You can only enlarge your imagination into charity, not connivance, towards all life, and prize all harmonies attainable, whether simple or complex. Reason is itself a particular standard proper to spirit, which glows and sings in the measure in which it escapes distinction and beholds the ideal of every effort without undergoing its strain or sharing its cruelty. Thus the psyche, the unified movement of a natural, organic body, when it is well knit and capable of self-knowledge, may possibly establish liberty and justice in its own internal economy and in its action. But the life of families and nations is many-centered, and the social impulses that sway such an aggregate take root more or less deeply and more or less casually in each individual. Therefore, in the state of nature, there can be often wild rebellion when the individual asserting liberty and justice after his own heart becomes indistinguishably a hero and a criminal, or else there may be only mindless submission to the domination of custom or a magnetic leader or of a superstitious spell. A social order approaching rationality can be secured only by institutions, that is to say, by artificial organisms, robber bands, secret societies, religious fraternities, or political governments that can sanction verbal laws by force. In civilized states, the strings that secure concerted action are more complicated and bear official names, but they are essentially the same strings. Sometimes a quasi-religious movement of public feeling is fused with semi-rational political aims. When Gladstone, for instance, launched an oratorical crusade against Turkish atrocities in Bulgaria, it was not because the British government had undertaken to stop atrocities all over the world. It was rather by the coincidence of two motives, one moral and sectarian, the other commercial and patriotic. Humanitarian, liberal feelings in Gladstone and his supporters suffered at the thought not only that there should be atrocities at all, but that they should be going on in a region where energetic use of British influence might arrest them. Moreover, in this case, the victims were Orthodox Christians, sound enemies of the Pope, and the tyrant was the Porte, a power in whose crumbling empire Great Britain had a comprehensible and almost legitimate interest. Intervention, if it became necessary, will be justified both as morally urgent and as politically far-seeing. The objects, intimately important to each human being, are inevitably various, and the active pursuit of them is let loose by the opportunity that circumstances seem to offer for this or that satisfaction. To secure each satisfaction for everybody cannot be the express aim of any government or of any social institution, since such an aim would be infinitely complex and variable. Neither good government, therefore, nor high morality, but the play of vital liberty is the immediate multiform source of human happiness, and the best government and the best society, from this point of view, will be those whose pressure never makes itself felt. This does not mean that a man, to be free, must revert to the jungle, for in the jungle he would suffer from unmitigated pressure of all the untamed forces of nature and of wild animals and men. A good government, by economic arts, turns the forces of nature as far as possible from enemies into servants, and the pressure of society into friendly cooperation and an opportune stimulus to each man's latent powers. It is in these ways that government can be government for the people, and society a benefit to its members. A radical liberalism in social philosophy would limit the function of government to the defense of liberty in each person. Economic and liberal arts will be left entirely to the initiative of individuals or of voluntary groups, and private and public morals would also be free, so long as they involve no physical aggression against others. This might seem to invite moral and aesthetic anarchy, and a tendency to such anarchy has actually come to the surface in the 20th century. Yet, the liberal leaders of the 19th century had and expected to foster a strictly uniform humanitarian morality and social decorum. They were Protestant pedants in frock coats with virtues protected by wealth, and they hoped soon, by education, to raise mankind to their own level. Theirs was a kind of vital liberty, strictly limited, but limited by choice. They did not perceive that what they offered mankind was vacant freedom only, with no direction assigned to it. In other words, they left human nature free because they assumed that human nature was predetermined to develop a particular, unchangeable type of virtue and happiness, the type which they loved and assigned to themselves. They thought it pure benevolence and unselfishness on their part to teach every child and every foreigner the way he should go and the way he should think, for it was only backwardness in the world not to have discovered it. The belief that we know what is good for others better than they do may be foolish or wise. Foolish when it rests on the presumption that life is everywhere radically addressed to what we address it. Wise when we see the difficulties and the failures that external and persistent circumstances prepare for the unwary. Liberals are not the only dogmatists who, when in power, think they are ruling for the good of mankind. Kings and nationalist dictators often repeat that they are the servants of their people, and the Pope styles himself Servus Servorum Dei. They are often sincere, but it is not the miscellaneous vital freedom of actual human psyches that they are serving, but a speculative vision of their own, their country, or the kingdom of God. It is only canalized liberty, like that of water flowing through a lock, that excites their zeal or gives them satisfaction. That the people need such locks in order to flow to advantage must be assumed by any government that undertakes to train and to manage them. Silent acquiescence on the people's part, or protests from a noisy party among them, prove nothing one way or the other. The Pope and the nationalist dictators have at heart for the world a higher good than it knows of. The service required may be sophistically called perfect freedom, if the people will only train themselves to love nothing else. Yet in reality, it presupposes a terrible sacrifice of almost all that their nature craved, and this sacrifice becomes more tragic and annihilating as it becomes more enthusiastic and more complete. Let us grant that it may be the ideal of a saint or of a soldier. It remains, even so, the fruit of a most special passion, glorious as it may be thought by those who seek to attain it. Even for them it is a martyrdom, and if imposed by a government on a whole people, it condemns them to a collective suicide.